This is day 26 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The world has its eyes on the war in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific, things seem to be heating up. In the latest, Beijing has compared the Quad to the NATO. It calls the bloc-based division in the region as dangerous as NATO itself. This is what China's vice foreign minister had to say. I'm quoting now. Going against the trend to pursue the Indo-Pacific strategy, provoke trouble, put together closed and exclusive small circles or groups, get the region off course toward fragmentation and bloc-based division is as dangerous as the NATO strategy of eastward expansion in Europe. If allowed to go on unchecked, it would bring unimaginable consequences and ultimately push the Asia-Pacific over the edge of an abyss. There are two main takeaways from this statement. One, China is blaming NATO's eastward expansion for the conflict in Ukraine. And two, this is a warning for the Quad. This is not the first time that Beijing has compared the Quad to the NATO, but this time it seems to be warning the group. Beijing says a search for absolute security could lead to insecurity. According to China, there are two options in the Indo-Pacific. One would be an open and inclusive community helping cooperation flourish, and the other, an Indo-Pacific divided into small blocks. It says the Quad is part of the second one, and this could escalate into further confrontation. The NATO is a defensive alliance of 30 countries. The Quad, on the other hand, is a grouping of like-minded countries. It is based on principles. It has a broader purpose. It calls itself a force for global good. Here's what India's External Affairs Minister had to say about the Quad. I'm quoting, Quad is a grouping of 4 countries that have common interests, common values, a great deal of comfort, that happen to be located at 4 corners of the Indo-Pacific. I would urge you not to slip into that lazy analogy of an Asian NATO. The Quad consists of the United States, India, Australia and Japan. It emerged in 2004. It was formalized in 2007. It lay dormant for the next 10 years and was again revived in 2017. But the turning point for the group was in 2020. This is when it assembled at a leader level. So what sprung the Quad into action suddenly? It was China's action in the Indo-Pacific. For 16 years, Quad was a talking shop. But since 2020, the stakes have been bigger for the group. China's unilateral actions in the region brought the Quad together. The goal of the group is simple: a free and open Indo-Pacific that is in the interest of all. For India, the stakes are even higher. It is the only Quad country that shares a border with China. It is the only Quad nation that has been in direct conflict with China. India has the most to gain and the most to lose from the Quad grouping. The United States has said India is central to the United States Indo-Pacific strategy as well. The US views India's emergence on the global stage as a counter to China. Both the countries have a lot at stake in the region, and India could be the bulwark against Chinese aggression here. To compare the Quad to a military alliance like the NATO is simplistic and misleading. Security and countering China's aggression are crucial for the Quad, but that's not the only focus of this grouping. The Quad extends beyond security to other areas of cooperation like trade, global supply chains, climate change, as well as cyber security. And to decode India's Indo-Pacific strategy and what the Quad stands for, joining us on the broadcast are Atul Taneja, who is the editor of India Narrative from New Delhi. Also joining us is John Ereth from Washington, D.C. He is the policy director of the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation in Washington. Thanks very much for being here with us. Let me come to you first, Atul, for your assessment of this comparison and what China is trying to do here with that statement.
Well, to be honest, Quad has mutated from what it used to be. It had a more security accent, but after the onset of the COVID pandemic, there's a very distinct a movement or mutation away from the military to supply chains, to alternate supply chains minus China, vaccines, climate change, something which you have already listed in your introductory remarks. So I think two things happened. One is the quote-unquote civilianization of the Quad into civilian areas. And simultaneously, another process took place, which was absolute military in its intent, which was the formation of the AUKUS, which is the Australia, UK, and US military alliance, including nuclear submarines with Australia. Now, that is something which is militarily confronting China. It's absolutely clear. But I think Quad's role has shifted from there, primarily because India had to balance while Indo-Pacific remains a very strong area of prime interest, it also had to move in view of its strategic autonomy to engaging with Eurasia, which included Russia. So I think that balance has been struck now. And I don't think Quad, as we had perceived it, say about a year ago or a year and a half ago, it's no longer that entity. It's moved in a different direction. And AUKUS has come in, which does not include the Asian countries, which is India and Japan, and is frankly a white English-speaking Anglo-Saxon club, which is directly confronting China. So those are the kind of mutations which have taken place in our region in the last 1.5 years.
John Erith, what do you make of that statement? What's the messaging according to you?
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I think it's very clear that NATO and the Quad are fundamentally different sorts of groupings. NATO is a political military alliance, including the North Atlantic countries. The Quad is a grouping of like-minded countries with a much broader agenda. It has not the focus solely on security issues. It goes beyond much beyond the security sphere. And in fact, the most important recent cooperation has been in countering the pandemic. So I think one has to look at what is the purpose of this Chinese messaging. And it's very clearly aimed at a Chinese audience that has been fed the narrative that the conflict in Ukraine was a result of something NATO did. That's obviously not the case, but that is what is being understood in China. And so this is a way that the Chinese government expresses its discomfort with the Quad grouping in terms that are of immediate interest and immediate newsworthiness to the Chinese audience.
Atul, what implications could China's aggressive stance, increasingly aggressive stance, also at a time when it has been increasing its incursions into Taiwan during the Ukraine war, and in a way looking at the war as an opportunity?
I very much doubt whether the Chinese are going to make that kind of a movement towards Taiwan. Of course, there is concern in the Western alliance that Ukraine sets a precedent in a way that Russia's attack on Ukraine can set a precedent in the Indo-Pacific, which means that China pursues a similar stance or a similar similar action in the Indo-Pacific, specifically meaning that it attacks Taiwan. But I doubt very much whether the Chinese are at this point in time ready for that. I think the Chinese, in their perception, are very clear that the multipolar world has arrived, that there is a perceptible US decline as economic terms. We saw it, but you know what happened in Afghanistan is also, and the exit, rather unceremonious exit of the United States from Afghanistan also gave an impression, right or wrong, that this particular Western alliance is weakening because its leader is both economically and militarily, may not be in terms of military hardware, but in terms of political will, is on the way out. And Chinese understanding is that their time is coming now, and they'll be patiently looking for more opportunities, both in the geopolitical and the geoeconomic sphere. So I think they're going to wait and watch. And I think the Ukrainian crisis is the inflection point, which is testing out, frankly, the West. Whether it can do anything to materially change the situation in Ukraine if Russia achieves its strategic objectives, which is really to see that the Donbas area it becomes a Russian sphere of influence and Crimea remains its own, and the eastward shift of NATO is contained, then and there is at least, if not regime change or change in regime behavior in Kyiv, then it has achieved its military objectives, and Chinese will be watching that. So I think they are waiting for their time, and I see no motivation right now for Chinese to see this natural flow of a mutation of the international order from a unilateral position as it existed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but more of a multipolar world where power is diffused among many players, but nevertheless, United States probably being the most important pole in this. So I think that is going to be the game from the Chinese side. But you are absolutely right that the Ukrainian situation is really an inflection point. And from a Chinese perspective, they are testing out the political and the military will from the Western Alliance in shaping the events that are currently underway in Ukraine.
All right. Since you mentioned that, just to follow up, how concerned should India be, since you talk about gains and losses as a grouping when it comes to India playing the role that it has so far, and in the backdrop of these warnings that have been coming in from China, now the latest one targeting the Quad?
You see, India has maintained or fixated itself to this doctrine of strategic autonomy, which is an interest-driven foreign policy where it is one of the major poles of the multipolar world, which engages on both sides on the Indo-Pacific, not as an alliance partner with the West, but to the extent that it serves its national interests. So far, there was a commonality, a common strategic goal, which was China. But I think that has somehow got upset when the West has suddenly moved from China and moved towards Russia. And that's where the dissonance comes in between India and the Western interests. Because for India, Russia is as important as is the West from a military point of view, from a historical perspective, and from a people-to-people perspective. So I think, and Eurasia is extremely important in terms of its resources to India's rise as a major global power. So I think that India will continue to exercise its strategic autonomy, which would mean, and the Chinese know this. And while you talk about the warnings which are coming from China, there is another thing which is happening. The Chinese foreign ministry and state council is most probably coming to India by the month end. And that is where I think the political track between India and China is going to open up, especially after the border frictions which we have. So the Chinese at this time will be very keen, as would be the Russians, that in this fluid situation, that India becomes a swing player and balances, and if not, shows a greater inclination towards what they would call as the BRICS international order, which includes the emerging economies and Russia and China, and therefore plays a major role in shifting the global balance of power. I think India has to play its cards very carefully here. And I think it has been doing well by exercising neutrality towards Ukraine situation right now.
Right.
But but it's still open-ended. It depends on how the situation unfolds, and I think India will be a critical player in the stance it takes on what a new world order emerges after the Ukraine crisis is behind us.
John, what about the United States? How concerned should Washington be looking at this statement, looking at the warnings coming in from China so far?
I think Washington is concerned, certainly about the situation in Ukraine and certainly about how China will read this. There's one aspect I would call attention to, and that is the role of nuclear weapons. Russia has used the threat of nuclear weapons as a way to say to other countries, stay away, do not try to support Ukraine, or else you could be exposing yourself to nuclear war. This is very serious because it's the first time that nuclear weapons have been used in such a role and not in terms of deterring aggression against a nuclear weapon state. So they are supporting offensive action in this case, which increases the possibility that nuclear weapons could be used. And that is clearly a danger. And it's something that I think that the Chinese are paying very careful attention to as they look at expanding their own nuclear arsenal and informing their new nuclear doctrine.
Right.
It's something that a use of a nuclear weapon anywhere in the world will have effects beyond the borders of the country where it is used. So it's something that should concern everyone.
John and Atul, appreciate very much for joining us on the broadcast with those perspectives and inputs. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.